Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the beginning of another week and 4 shows we are bringing you about Romania in World War II. And in fact, it's going to be the first set of shows because there's enough people have contacted me to do a second set of shows later on in the year or perhaps maybe even next year. So Romania in World War II is a complicated subject because there's the fighting within the country itself. The Romanian army went to the Eastern Front. There's the defense. There's the Holocaust. There's all sorts of aspects of it. So it's a fascinating subject to dive into. And today I'm particularly excited because it's not just, we're not talking about battles today. We're talking about a whole range of things: racism, eugenics, deportation, Holocaust, culture. And so it's something that will really be interesting, I think. I think we'll all learn a lot, and it has a bit of topicality with what's going on in Ukraine right now. So my guest, Marius Turda, is a professor, and he encompasses history and medicine and eugenics, and he teaches at Oxford Brookes University. So without further ado, I'll bring Marius into the show. So good evening, Marius. How are you today? Well, I know how you are.
I'm very well, thank you. And I'm particularly pleased to be here with you, Paul.
Good. So it's a complicated subject, lots of facets to it, because we're encompassing culture and the clash of different peoples and different races and ideologies. And so, obviously, you, for people who don't know, you've got a deep personal connection with this region. Your ancestry is from this part of the world. So, you relatives who were in World War II, where did your interest begin in studying this aspect of it?
Well, like you say, it might not be a battle of military technology, but it was certainly a battle of ideas and a battle of ideologies. And you could see this developing so well during the Second World War, culminating in the Holocaust. And certain ideas remain embedded in the history of Eastern Europe to this day. And regrettably, we could see that aggressive form of nationalism and racism re-emerging. In connection to my interest in the topic, as you pointed out, my family comes from northern Transylvania. I was born in northern Transylvania in a region called Maramureș. Both my great parents on my maternal and paternal grandparents were in camps during the Second World War. My maternal grandfather was a prisoner of war for 8 years in Siberia in the Gulag. My maternal great-grandfather was a prisoner of war during World War II. So I have a lot of stories about, and I should like to say that also that my grandfather was shot twice, actually. So there's something that I always remember since the first conversations I had with him about the war and about the major battles in the East, because he fell prisoner in the East during the invasion of Soviet Union after 1941. And he always told me vivid stories about it, protecting me to some extent, because obviously he will never talk about the killings, but he will talk about the human sufferings and the human empathy and the effort you put to save your friend. So all the human values. But at the same time, there is also a story about the Holocaust. And I come from a region which was very known for its Jewish population, which in 1944 was basically obliterated. They were taken to Auschwitz and exterminated. So to the point that about 95% of them perished, or very few returned now in 1945. And at the moment, that region of Transylvania is basically devoid of any Jewish population. Very few people actually have returned, and very few people are there. So there are two connections, Paul, here. One, with the war itself, and I think as many East Europeans can tell you, or people with East European origin, this is the fundamental event in our family history, whether you were deported or you were displaced, or you lost family members, or you lost everything. Then it's the Holocaust. And in some cases, like it happens with us, behind the Iron Curtain is, of course, the communism, which came afterwards. So there's the third element to it, because obviously after the Second World War, we did not go triumphantly. We did not march into the democratic West, but we fell under the occupation of the Soviet Union. And then, of course, for 50 almost years, we were behind the Iron Curtain. So these three important events covering a big chunk of the 20th century history have direct connection to me personally and to many of us who are from Eastern Europe.
Well, that was a great introduction, and it, as you said there, it's about human beings. It's about all these issues that are still day to day with us, and unfortunately in the news right now. And when we're doing a show about a dive bomber from 1942, that dive bomber hasn't existed for 80 years. So it's a conversation solely about the past, and we are talking about the past today. But of course, the themes of hatred, of genocide, of deportations, of people having to move from one place because they're being persecuted to another place, they are, alas, still very much with us. So you've come, as all my guests do, prepared with a PowerPoint. So you'll just need to tell me next slide when you want to move through. So lots of heavy subjects tonight, folks. So if you have questions for Marius, just fire away and we will let him know. And otherwise, we will sit back and learn about this incredible and often very devastatingly sad period of history. So it's over to you, Marius.
There are many ways to approach this topic. And as I chose to speak about the Roma and the deportation of the Roma population from Romania to Transnistria, I thought would be important to highlight some of the elements of this complicated conversation. And there are many ways to get around it. And I represent a certain tradition of or line of reasoning of looking and reading this history. And the other scholars who had, take another approach, I suppose. But ultimately, the facts are the facts. 25,000 Roma were deported to Transnistria. Half of them were children. So Romania did engage in ethnic cleansing and genocidal policies and policies of purification of its population, as it was called at the time, not only towards its Jewish minority, but of course towards the Roma. So these are the two main groups which were targeted by racist legislation, in the case of the Jews, then by deportation and killings and pogroms, and in the case of the Roma, of course, by deportation. Although there is a great debate about how that deportation came about and whether it was motivated by racism, by eugenics, or by simple, military strategic considerations, ultimately, even if scholars quibble about these details, some of the things remain very clear and have to be spoken out. One of them is the attitudes towards the Roma then as now, the anti-Roma racism that exists in Romania, and which has a long history. Hence, the beginning of my talk and our conversation, Paul, is with slavery. I'm not arguing that slavery led to the Holocaust. What I'm arguing is that if you look at the long history of anti-Roma racism in Romania, slavery plays an important role. Very few people know, very few people in Romania, now this is becoming more of a known topic, but very few people know that the Roma were slaves for 500 years. Wow. So if we're talking about 5 centuries of slavery, Roma enslavement, and they were basically, as you would, as some of our listeners know from other contexts, from the North American context or from South American context, they were basically treated as inferior human beings, as objects. They were sold and their families pulled apart, their children taken from their mothers and fathers. Everything that comes with the things we know about slavery. But of course, we know little about the fact that within what would become Romania after 19th century, this population were kept slaves. And of course, the memory of slavery is extremely important, and the attitude the majority of the population has towards the Roma works within certain patterns of thought and attitudes that were attributed to the Roma because they were, different. They belonged to a different race. They came from elsewhere. And then, of course, they were not able to integrate into Romanian society after they were freed as slaves. And you have immediate a question. You're asking yourself, how can you integrate a slave? I mean, look what's happening in North America after so many intensive programs and governmental policies very heavily sustained by educational policies, financial needs, compensation, and indeed the desire of the majority to come to terms with slavery. Even there, the problem and the memory of slavery constitutes a serious issue. It still remains one of the open wounds of American society. Imagine this in a country like Romania, where the process of accepting, coming to terms with slavery and teaching about it and what it meant to both Roma and Romanians in historical perspective is barely in its incipient stage.
So, just to jump in with a question, Marius, I mean, it seems to me from the language you've used already is that it's a difficult subject for Romanians to understand that this awful history from World War II isn't solely from World War II. It goes back centuries before then, and I guess extends beyond it. And it's a difficult period to confront because it's not all quote unquote Hitler's fault, which is kind of the convenient tag to kind of often put everything that's in remotely connected to the Holocaust is just blame it on the little guy with the moustache. But in fact, as you're explaining now, there's actually a lot of history before this already.
Indeed, in all contexts in East Central Europe, you have to understand the internal traditions. If we're talking about the independent state of Croatia, or you talk about Hungary, or you talk about Romania during World War II, there is a local tradition of how certain people were portrayed within the entire process of creating a nation state. Now, of course, this is something many of your listeners will probably know. We're talking about a state that was initially formed in 1859. You have the Moldavia and Wallachia coming together. This is where the Roma slaves existed until mid-19th century when they were freed. And then this kingdom of Romania then unites with the other regions. They got after First World War from the Austro-Hungarian and the Russian Empire. So you get Transylvania, northern Transylvania, Maramuresh, the Banat, and the Bukovina and Bessarabia. So the tradition of Roma slavery within the Romanian psyche, of course, it's very different regionally, because Romanians from Transylvania or the Banat did not have this story of the Roma slaves in the same way, or they don't really empathize with it in the same way, because their tradition and their history is slightly different until 1918. Notwithstanding these differences, and obviously this is not a discussion about slavery, but to give us an indication how to understand a bit better the panoply of arguments that in the end contribute significantly to the Holocaust, and in particular for us today to the deportation of the Roma, is that you need to understand these regional diversities, but at the same time this important history that characterizes the Roma population in that particular part. Now, after 1918, of course, Romania becomes Greater Romania and embarks on a process of modernizing, creating a new nation state that includes all the Romanians. But of course, it came with significant ethnic minorities. And so while a lot of the effort, particularly nationalist effort in Transylvania and the Banat, was directed at traditional ethnic minorities such as the Hungarians and the Germans, the Roma always remain part of that process of trying to come to terms with what is the Romanian and how you would define the Romanian. Now, eugenics becomes very popular at the time, and now we know enough about Romanian eugenics to be able to offer a quite detailed analysis of how it worked and the levels of circulations of ideas, and how it was implemented, how it was embraced by very important politicians and scientists. And here you have an example. I was able, after more than 2 decades of research, to really put together what I think is probably the complete list of all the eugenic societies in Romania. And as you can see, it's not only geographically diverse. So you have, of course, the capital, Bucharest. and then, of course, the regional capitals, Cluj in Transylvania, or Chisinau, and Timișoara in the Banat. So you have the east and the west and north and south. And it's very well developed, and many traditions, of course, of eugenic thought. And they were interspersed with the program of building a Romanian nation state, building a biopolitical nation state. At the time, of course, for many of these people, eugenics was just another form of nationalism. Particularly for the eugenicists from Transylvania, they looked at eugenics and biopolitics as another way of actually formulating a modern form of nationalism. So you have this nationalist eugenics emerging after 1918, predominantly in Transylvania and in the Banat, which is making its way towards the capital, Bucharest. Now, the medical tradition with which we are quite familiar in the West, when we come to and we discuss eugenics, you have psychiatrists and you have geneticists and you have biologists. This too was represented in Romania and Romanian Society for Eugenics, and the study of heredity that was created in 1935 was established by the most prominent Romanian physician of all time, probably, certainly one of the most, certainly the most prestigious psychiatrists Romania has ever produced, which is Gheorghe Marinescu. And he represented this medical tradition of eugenics. In Bucharest, early on, beginning with the early 20th century, they were talking about eugenics in relation to degenerates, sterilization of defectives, people with mental disabilities. They weren't talking about ethnic minorities. They didn't really, envelop the eugenic program within biopolitical nationalist rhetoric of how can we protect the state and the race. But the Transylvanians were very keen to add that element to it. So by the 1930s, what you have in Romania, it's a symbiosis, it's a synergy between various traditions of nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism, and eugenics and biopolitics. And people are contributing to it in various ways, whether we're talking about ethnography, linguistics, sociology, demography, anthropology, medicine. Ultimately, all of these sciences became national sciences. So it's not enough to have a sociology. You need to have a Romanian sociology, right? It's not enough to have an anthropology. You need to have an anthropology for the Romanian nation. That was the point of nationalizing a scientific discourse and transforming a scientific disciplines. I mean, in this country, in England or in America, this process occurred as well. However, because of the imperial connection, the global spread of English language and English science, the line between the national version of and the international version of a particular discipline was more blurred. But in East Central Europe, you can see this in Poland, you can see this in Hungary, you can see this in Greece, you can see this in Yugoslavia. They all tried. So once they assimilated and internalized a discussion about human improvement, as it was, yes, eugenics, which emerged at the end of the 19th century in Britain, and then America and Germany, they nationalized it. So it was eugenics for the Romanian people. So we want to apply eugenic thinking, eugenic practices to protect the future of the Romanian race, of the Romanian population.
And just to jump in there, because I think you've just come up with something I was going to say, because when I hear the word eugenics in 2022, I have very much a negative reaction to that word. It just sounds awful and all sorts of evil connotations. But back in the 1920s and 30s, we're establishing all sorts of new technologies. It's the post-industrial revolution. How would the term generally have been received in sort of 1920s, 30s medicine, science? I mean, is it, because you said they're human improvement, because those two words isolated sound a good thing. Human improvement sounds positive. So linguistically, how has our understanding of the word eugenics changed over the decades?
Thank you for that caveat, Paul. It's important to highlight this historical paradox, if you wish, right? And of course, human improvement should be put in quotation marks from our perspective. At the time, of course, they truly believed the human population and the race or the nation can be improved through scientific methods such as selective breeding or social breeding and various technologies such as, sterilization. At the time, it was seen as though scientific again, methodology, which is able, on the one hand, to synthesize various disciplines. So, and eugenicists put together anthropology, sociology, demography, statistics, genetics, and medicine. So it has this capacity to really bring together so many different aspects of disciplines which deal with human societies. At the same time, of course, it's very geared towards, being the tip of the iceberg, building on developments in heredity and evolution and genetics. So it pretended to be, the tip of that scientific iceberg. So it sold itself as a serious thing, and it sold itself as a progressive. They never said they're democratic from the very beginning. Of course, they were never democratic. It was about certain people who deserve to live and procreate, and others don't. Now, others could be people who with severe disability, could be women, could be people of color, could be ethnic minorities, as the Roma were considered in Romania in the 1940s, or it could be the Jews, or as they were in Nazi Germany, or it could be Slavic people, or it could be homosexuals or gay people, queer people. So it very much differed who were the people they targeted. Now, of course, like you pointed out, we are used to look at eugenics through the prism of Nazi experiments and Nazi racial hygiene. And we've been inculcated with this reading of eugenics for so long. And when I studied it in school, and when I started working on it here at the university, people knew a great deal about eugenics, but they knew just maybe a wee bit about what happened in America, and a great deal about what happened in Nazi Germany. We didn't know much about what happened in Britain, although, of course, eugenics was coined by a British scientist, English scientist, Francis Galton, in the 1880s, a half cousin of Charles Darwin. So there's a very profound English tradition. And of course, the entire interwar period, not only we built a strong eugenic society here, but we also influenced the development of what happens with the welfare state in the 1950s. And then we exported that throughout the world. But we didn't know about that. It's only now. So you can imagine how little was known about eugenics in a country like Romania, which they never even accepted that it could be. So whatever it was about racism and racial eugenics and sterilization, it was always read, like you pointed out, through the Nazi influence. And the Nazi doctors did that. And if there was any deviation from the norm in Romania, would have been because the Nazi intervened and forced the Romanians to be racist or be eugenically inclined or adopt various eugenic rhetoric, which now we know finally the entire scholarship, which we built for the past 20 years, a number of scholars, myself included, not only about Romania, but about the region in general, demonstrates very clearly there is a profound innovation as well as imitation when it comes to the history of eugenics. Racism is slightly different because, of course, you have a longer tradition and a longer history of debates about the race and what is the Romanian race that goes back to the 19th century. So major figures in the national pantheon of Romania, politicians, poets, philosophers, people who created the national canon. In each country, you have a handful of people, handful of intellectuals who basically build the most important list of ingredients constituting national canon, right? So when we're talking about the countryside as one factor, as it is here, the England as it used to be, the countryside, or which of course works very well in Romania as well, the peasantry, right? The Romanian peasant as the epitome of national vitality and racial energy. You always go back to the village to resurrect the race. So all of these discussions start by mid 19th century. Romania becomes a state, and it includes all of these ideas and strategies as to how to define a Romanian, And of course, until the 1930s and 40s, they don't go full-blown racist, as we understand it from the point of view of the West, because no one in Romania would argue, for example, for racial purity. They always argued we are very mixed as a population. However, there is a superior Romanian racial element that has to be protected, and that exists. Now, they had problems, and anthropologists worked very hard during the interwar period where to place that Romanian element. I mean, each country does the same thing. So the Germans did it, the Hungarians did it, the French did it, and the English did it as well. What do we place? The quintessential English person. What do we place? The quintessential Romanian person. And then, of course, once you identify the region, you try to argue that that has to be protected. People coming from there has to be encouraged to, to have more children, for example, and so on and so forth. At the same time, who doesn't belong to the normative definition of Romanianness, of what Romanian is, has a serious problem. And this brings me to the whole discussion in the 1930s and 40s about the Roma. Because, of course, the Roma, after emancipation, were integrated, at least officially, into the Romanian state. They weren't given many rights at first, but after the First World War, they were allowed to buy land, so they could become proprietors. They were given that chance. They were allowed to take part in the political life. They could establish their own organizations, which they did. So there is an incipient political life emerging, but they weren't recognized as a minority. It was assumed simply that they would assimilate. Those nomadic Roma who could not assimilate, they were treated in a way by the society and by the political and the cultural elites as something distinct. Now, anthropology and racial anthropology, scientific racism and eugenics come and says, well, we have a serious problem now. We've been allowing this to happen for a while, and certainly slavery didn't help because these people lived together with the Romanians, and they mixed and they created a miscegenation occurred, ethnic mixing occurred, which was detrimental to the Romanian majority. It weakened the Romanian racial body. It weakened because it mixed with an inferior race. By 1900, scientific racism argues that these people are not only coming from India, which was established linguistically and anthropologically, but they represent an inferior race. So what Romanians do, as many other East Europeans, Paul, it's a two-pronged thing in the 1930s that would basically explode with tragic consequences during the Second World War. They build almost, hyperbolic definition of Romanianness, of normative Romania, which, has to be in a certain way, the ideal type Romanian, if you want. At the same time, that process is overlapping with something which we can call ethnic cleansing, an internal cleansing, right? It's the same you would do to your own body individually, right? You purify your own body, you have a shower in the morning, you shave. If you shave, you get prepared for the day ahead, or you prepare for the battle ahead. So when the Romanian nation gets into the 1930s, and there is another war looming on the horizon by 1938, 1939, they start losing territories. Northern Transylvania goes to Hungary, Bukovina and eastern parts go to Soviet Union. They realize they are under siege, and they go into like full gear to really accelerate this process of creating an ideal of Romania, which is a Romania only with Romanians, because the others are deemed to be a problem. And that process of cleanliness, you have to get rid of minorities you don't want, because they are a danger and a threat to us. Now,
it's just to jump in a bit. Sorry, it seems there's a bit of a paradox going on in the sense that we're talking about the end of the empire's era. So all you've mentioned countries: Hungary, Germany, Russia. This, the 19th century, early 20th century, everybody's jostling for position within that part of Europe is how big their stake is within all these other competing empires and allegiances that have been going on in history. So on the one hand, and correct me if I'm wrong, Romania wants to present this image of strength and lots of population and unity, so that they appear strong to the outside, but then internally they want to start sorting out exactly who the Romanian identity is with a smaller part of the population. So there's kind of paradoxically opposites going on at this point.
You're absolutely right, and there's the paradox of this of how racism worked in these countries, and this is in a way a very interesting method they later use to exculpate, to get rid of any unwanted things from the past, because they said because he couldn't spot the paradox like you did now. They simply said, well, we weren't racist. The English are racist. The Germans, the Nazi were racist, but not the Romanians. We're just patriotic. We're actually fighting for survival, trying to protect ourselves, because they were able to play this very astutely. Now, it worked for many decades, actually, until recently, but now we're finally able to call it as it was. All these paradoxical and idiosyncratic representations of racism at the time should be spelled out, and we, as people interested in that particular moment in time, but also people interested in the long perspective, should be able to go back and question these assumptions, and that's clearly what happened. Because obviously, as I pointed out, it became clear that if you don't have a very strong idea of racism, in other words, you don't plea for racial superiority, which they say, well, Romanians are not like the Germans. We don't argue that we are superior to other races or nations. We just want to be superior in our own country. Secondly, you say, well, we know after racial purity, so we know we're mixed people. Even the entire mythology of Romanian nation cultivates this dual origin. You have the original inhabitants of the region, and then of course the Roman conquest of that region, and what the Romanians are sort of the descendants of both Roman colonists and original population, the Dacians and the Thracians. So when you have a dual origin, as it were, it's very hard to argue there was anything pure there to start with. However, they did believe that a new Romanian state could only fulfill its historical mission and historical destiny if it embarks on the same path of purification and renewal as other states did at the time. And of course, the impulse that came from countries such as Italy during fascism, and then of course after 1933 Nazi Germany, was a powerful push towards the direction, because they felt, well, if Germany is embarking on this, and obviously it's convincing the countries around it, Hungary does the same, and then Croatia, they are going to defeat Soviet Union. So Bolshevism is that was the big thing, of course, defeat Bolshevism. Then within that, we're going to annihilate all the Jewish population, so get rid of the Jews, seen as the internal enemy par excellence. So all of these countries have powerful Jewish communities, powerful in terms of their numbers, so significant Jewish population. And then, of course, it will come the next stage of complete purification of the new Europe under the Nazi tutelage, under the Nazi umbrella, as you know, which is basically get rid of people with disabilities, which the Germans already were doing with the T4 program, and then ethnic minorities, which were deemed undesired, unwanted, and problematic, racially inferior, intellectually, culturally, economically, and that was the Roma. So right. There was and if you go back to that slide where we have a bit of Roma racial research on the Roma, it should probably come afterwards. So go forward, Paul, please. Yeah, forward. It should probably be next. I think we need to look in a broader sweep. Yes, please. Yeah, that's the one. So there is a very keen interest on behalf of anthropology, and they're very interested in the Roma, both sedentary Roma, so people Roma who didn't move and traveled, and nomadic or itinerary Roma. And so here you have some examples. The one on my left, the left of the screen, is basically is from a book by a Swiss anthropologist, Eugène Pitard, very important. He carried out a great deal of anthropological research in the Balkans, so from Greece all the way to Transylvania. And he looked at various ethnic populations, and he was amongst the first to actually just sustain research on the Romans in the Ottoman Empire and in areas such as Dobruja. And this is an image from Dobruja is a region in Romania after was part of the Ottoman Empire, became part of Romania after 1878. And you have that, they have this anthropological gaze really trying to go deep into understanding the Roma as an ethnic group, as a racial unit, but also understand the soul and the music of the Roma. And the Roma, of course, are very famous if you look at other Central European contexts, particularly Hungary, where, of course, the Roma musicians traditionally have been researched and tried to portray within a particular ethnopedagogy regarding how they contribute to the national culture. So you have a variety, a spectrum of opinion regarding this population from an ethnographic and anthropological point of view. At the right side of the picture, what we have, Paul is basically Nazi racial research on the Roma, where the ethnographers were turned anthropologists, and they were measuring their head, trying to prove they have different skulls and different brains and different physical characteristics than the white Europeans or the host population. Or they were closer to the Turks or to the Bulgarians in this particular context in the Bruja, rather than the Romanians, for example. By 1920s and 30s, with the development of blood group research, it becomes very racist and anthropological in the sense that basically it's eugenic. It's about finding what is the Roma, the Roma gene. And this is the line of research culminate in Mengeles' experiments in Auschwitz, where he would experiment on Roma people to find what constitutes a Roma. They did the same with the Jews. So can we find a Jewish gene? Maybe we could find a Roma gene. So what makes a Roma? So Nazi scientists believe that can be identified. So we have this example
at this point, Marius, sorry to interrupt.
Nazi racial scientist.
So it seems to me at this point there's like a divergence between real science and shitty, just evil science. In that, when you're talking about anthropological studies into folklore and music and traditions, that's all good. I've got books on North American tribes and things where German anthropologists went there in the 19th century. Then you've got this evil side of it where it's trying to find, as you say there, the Roma gene or some kind of underlying feature by which they can then separate and then persecute. So it's, as someone who is studying both history and medicine, it must be difficult at some time to kind of see where the lines blur between genuine scientific approach and just twisted scientific approach.
And it's extraordinary and deeply troubling from our perspective to look at the amount of research that were poured out of universities and published in respected scientific journals about people in this way, trying to determine their inferiority. They were racially undesired and they were eugenically unwanted. And then we have, if we can't put them aside, put them in colonies or ghettos or create, no man's lands, deport them somewhere, as the Romanians did in 1942, send them to Transnistria. They will die there. They're like a human dumping ground for the Jews and the Roma. Then at least, so if we can't do that, then we'll have to exterminate them. So it's what basically they did in Auschwitz and other camps under occupation during the Holocaust. And in the middle, you have a picture or a graph from Romanian research at the time. Basically, I mentioned the importance of the village and the peasant for the codification of the national narrative about what Romanian was. The village was seen not only as the place where Romanian nation was born and is like the fountain of youth of the Romanian nation, if you wish, but also this is the place that has to be utmost protected. You can't really allow the peasants to degenerate. They do anyway because they drink too much. They malfunctioning on so many levels. They don't eat properly. They don't have hygienic conditions. So on top of that, if you have the Roma coming into a village and then infiltrating the Romanian texture of the social community there, then it causes degeneration. It leads to dysgenic people. So here you have, the word, the gypsies, the Tsigan, and dysgenic. So basically, they looked at various villages in Romania and see how you can predict its degenerate. The more Roma people you have in the village, more clearer it is. In 30 or 40 years, would be a village destroyed. So it would be not only non-Romanian It will lose its Romanian qualities of wonderful, racial values. It portrays, but even worse to some extent, it will become a village, namely a vector of disease, of malfunctioning, of undesired locality where you have to avoid and intervene and protect and manage. So the entire sort of biomedical thinking kicks in. So you have, like you pointed out, a very interesting transition where it's of the Roma are exotic, are interesting to look at, are examined for their maybe unique traditions that preserved after centuries of living in Europe amongst host populations. So ethnographers and musicologists, like you pointed out, they did the same in other parts of the world. They have these enclaves in Europe. Let's understand them better. Let's see what they have to offer. And then is this push towards a very radical, definition of ethnicity that leads to racism and eugenics, according to which these are people not to be desired and at best have to be eliminated from the territory. Worse, they have killed, which of course we know that by 1940s Romania is getting into. Very briefly, before we move there, I just want to highlight a few demographic details because people may think that, or people not familiar with Romania may not know. And very succinctly, Paul, I just want to say that the Roma were not the most important ethnic minority in Romania. So contrary to what you may think, or the Jews. So that's the other thing. You have the Hungarians, there was and the Germans, and then you have others. And the Roma, if you look at it, in 1930, when the proper census was conducted across Romania, so the first modern census, Greater Romania, the Roma is basically only 1.5 of the total population. 1.5. So it's very hard to argue, I suppose, how much of a racial threat these people were to the. But of course, in total, ethnic minorities were almost 28%, and that's a serious threat to the majority when you talk about 28%. So the whole discussion about minorities.
Jumping in again, Marius, it makes sense in some ways in the history of persecution of peoples is to pick on a small demographic, pick on a small one that you can blame for lots. I mean, how many times in history have we seen that where you kind of find a small little ethnic minority and then say, well, it's all their fault. I mean, we've seen this time and time again, isn't it? So from the evil that they're trying to do, it makes sense. Don't blame it on the 28% of the population because you need them. So blame it on a smaller one. It's weirdly there's method to their madness here. Evil, but I can see what they're doing. It's awful.
You're absolutely spot on, and indeed, the Roma were blamed for everything that was bad, from all the unhygienic conditions of Romanian cities to petty crime, to major crime, to the entire sort of moral decline of the Romanians. So there was a proper scapegoating happening. So the Roma were the scapegoat. And like you say, it's much easier to direct the attention to a small minority, and actually it's much easier to get rid of them if they are numerically not as strong as the other minorities. Of course, rhetoric was there. If it were for the Romanian nationalists and the Romanian purists, purification of Romania meant basically elimination of all ethnic minorities. That was the ideal. But of course, they knew practically impossible. Of course, you can't deal with the Germans when you have Nazi Germany protecting all the German enclaves in Eastern Europe. So there's no, the Romanians would not have started a war with East Germany, which by 1940 and 1944 would basically under direct rule of Berlin. So they couldn't really do much about it. And Hungarian minority in Transylvania, of course, was a different discussion, particularly after they lose northern Transylvania. And the only position or the only suggestions they have would be transfer of population. So they say we can send all the Hungarians we have and all the Romanians we have. They did the same with the Bulgarians. So there were transfer of populations happening. But the deportations were two groups were only targeted for deportations during this period. Jews, of course, and that's a story well known and well researched, and the Roma, and that's something that happens during Antonescu regimes after 1941. So if we move to the next slide, because I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but we mentioned racism, and there is an entire racial iconography building up towards the 1930s, targeting nomadic Roma. So you pointed out very clearly, and I agree with that, the ethnographic gaze of the early 20th century towards nomadic Roma turned very racist and very racial towards the 1930s, when these people were deemed completely impossible. So we can't do anything with them. They have to be dealt with. They don't want to assimilate. They're very different. So now we demonstrated scientifically that they're different race. They don't want to be part of the Romanian nation or the Romanian population or the Hungarian, what have you. So they were immediately targeted. So when Romania started talking about deporting Roma, it was the nomadic Roma they first targeted. And here you can see the entire construction of the racist argument towards Roma in Romania in particular, and in Europe more broadly, because to this day, nomadic Roma are seen as the buyers, the outsiders, the concept of a person who doesn't pay taxes, doesn't live in a house, lives by its own rules. It's very strange to our modern mind. We for the past centuries, we've been living with this idea that what makes us a normal human being, a citizen, is to do these sort of things, whilst of course they refuse to do that. So all this rhetoric about them being different, being a threat, really contributing to the disturbances in society, is used greatly and amplified by political rhetoric, and of course police or the gendarmes, where they called at the time, worked very closely with the military officials. And after the outbreak of the war, of course, it became clear that the military would need to keep everything under control and make sure that the country functions as as one, with no issues coming from minorities or groups of population, which could cause troubles to the functioning of war, and indeed to victory, because ultimately Romania was hoping still in 1941, 1942, on the side of Nazi Germany, that they will win the war in the east, and they will actually gain some of the territories they lost in 1940. So they have a military plan working, and I'm sure some of your other guests will discuss about that, but that is in a way infused with the long tradition of Romanian nationalism, which degenerated into racism and eugenics in the 1930s. And we need to be very clear about that. And you can see this with the nomadic Roma. And then if you go to the next slide, the eugenic argument then is being built against the sedentary Roma. The number of experts sitting down there looking up is Tabin Manuela, who was the director of the Central Institute of Statistics after 1930, a close collaborator of Ion Antonescu, and he was the one who directed the gigantic work of conducting the census in 1930. But then the other census that was conducted in 1942, where the Central Institute of Statistics tried to map out all the Roma living in Romania, and so they conducted a census. And then they have a list of all the Romas, and it's very interesting to see the eugenic arguments coming from the expert knowledge, statistic, demographic, tables and tables of people with, their names, their ethnic origin, their religion, and everything. Because of course, in 1942 they took ethnic origin into account. So in 1930. Manuela complains that the Roma refused to identify themselves too much as Roma, but apart from Transylvania, where they were kept because of the situation in Transylvania was of Hungarian, German, and Romanian nationalism was so strong, the Roma were easily identifiable, and they had a sense of, they are Roma, stronger along the lines of an ethnic definition of the group, rather than in Romania, where they pretended to be, everything else but Roma. And he highlighted this point, the argument, saying, we have serious issues. How many Romas we're talking about here? The 1930 census, as I pointed out, is 1.5. So basically, it's about 262,000 Romas. Eugenicists, like the chap who's standing out there, Iordache Făcăoară, one of the important Romanian eugenicists, who wrote extensively on the Roma, and in connection to sort of eugenic arguments about the Roma intelligence and Roma inferiority. He said maybe we're talking about 400,000. Others probably said we're talking about 600,000 Roma, because obviously, if we really go to their racial origin and we conduct a proper mapping of the Romanian population according to blood groups and racial anthropological criteria, then they basically will get to 600,000 Roma. And they're not counting, of course, those who mix with Romanians, which, of course, in the southern part of Romania were quite numerous. And there you have an example here of a very important sociological work, ethnographic and sociological work carried out in 1944 by important Romanian sociologist Ioan Kelcea, and who argued amongst certain things that, of course, some Roma should be kept, for example, for the study, for the like in a human zoo, we should keep a handful of Roma, study them, because if we kill them all or exterminate them all, they all disappear, then we actually lose something for science. And you realize, when we heard these kind of arguments in other parts of the world, we keep a few of these specimens just to illustrate, how diverse and primitive once humans were. But of course, now we all moved, we are extremely developed and progressive, and looking forward to a new world, to a new Europe, to a new Romania, where this basically cannot function. So you have, and this is a point I want to bring home, Paul, because we tend to, like you said, a lot of people look at eugenics as this kind of, crazy, pseudoscientific, insane theory, which is true, it is that. But at the same time, we are absolutely baffled by how many important and established and very confident scientists across the board were able to actually not only embrace these ideas and believe this is the future, we need to purify the human race of a desired element, but actually work with governments, became technocrats and experts, assisting military operations, like as it happened with these individuals here, who obviously were sent to Transnistria, were sent to the east, and the Central Institute of Statistics carried out anthropological research in Bessarabia and in Transnistria under Romanian occupation, or under Romanian administration, it was called. Of course, Transnistria was under Romanian administration until 1944. So they start basically, as I pointed out, deporting the Roma, nomadic Roma, almost all of them. This is just another data about how many Roma were in each region. So we could skip that, Paul, because that's not. So this is an indication of how the nomadic Roma were deported, beginning with June until August. So they deported all the nomadic Roma they could find. About 11,000 people, maybe 12,000 people, as I said, and half of them were children. So we're talking about 6,700 children or so. So you can imagine they deported entire families. There were many ways they were discussing how, maybe by boat. If you look on the Danube, going all the way through the Black Sea into Transnistria, that became too complicated. They realized maybe we'll just put them in trains. After all, trains already by then a well-known means of transportation, no pun intended, of people into the east, and of course into concentration camps. So they were crammed into trains and they were shipped there. Initially, with the plan to help the economy of the region. So the Roma was sent there to work. But of course, they were left there without no conditions, no medical assistance, no food. They started eating everything they could. They even resorted to cannibalism, some of them. So that was a serious problem for the Romanian army, and of course the German troops or German. How is it called in English? That the German
occupiers.
No, some
units.
Units. Yes, sorry. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you, Paul. German units operating in the part. Although the Transnistria was under Romanian administration, there were German units, of course, assisting the Romanians, either with procuring resources from that region and ship them to, or helping them with advice and so on and so forth. And then there's a second.
I've got a question for you, Marius, because I think I know the answer, but and it gives you a chance to have a sip of water. You've talked about the role of the government in this, and all these scientists who should have known better in this gradual progression of blaming everything on the Roma. But you're an average Romanian peasant worker, but you're not Roma. Had they been convinced by propaganda that everything was the fault of the Roma? So if, for example, they moved into your region and they started rounding up the Roma, be they the migratory kind of Roma, the travelers, or the static ones, if you're watching this, are you also believing that it's good for you that they go? Is there any support from other parts of the population? What's the feeling generally about the rest of the Romanians against the Roma at this point?
Oh, that's a very good question, Paul. Thank you for asking. And it is true that at the grassroots level, so common people and Romanian peasants, even urban population in various small towns across the eastern part or the southern part of Romania, from where most of the Roma were deported, actually did not really harbor this profound, eugenic argument. They may have felt racist or maybe behave in a racist way towards Roma every now and then, but we have a very clear example of people opposing the deportation of the Roma. Right. Many officials in various villages and towns in Romania did write to the government and say, why are you deporting these people? They are good people, they're working very hard. But that again, of course, it only illustrates that actually there was a racist argument. They were just and the eugenic argument. The fact that not all Romanians were racist or eugenically inclined doesn't mean that the argument wasn't there. It actually proves that you opposed a racist argument because it was racist, or you opposed a eugenic argument because it was eugenic, even if you didn't formulate it like that. So the opposition was like, why are you calling these people undesired and inferior? So they engage with that argument very interestingly. So, but you're absolutely right, and that's a significant nuance we have to bring forward, that it was a case where there's no overwhelming support for these policies. I mean, even after they start deporting the sedentary Roma, which happened in the second wave, by September 1942, they deported another 13,000 sedentary Roma. So these were the Roma, who were deemed a problem, criminals, rapists, thieves. I mean, the entire eugenic argument about asocials, these were the substandard humans that, so once they got rid with the nomadic, they turned to the sedentary, but then they stopped. So here you have the total number, I think 24,600 or something. And this is on the right, you can see one of the few images that survived of their living conditions, basically children and men, and how they live. They are absolutely in appalling conditions. I mean, half of them perished in Transnistria. They never returned after 1944, 1945. Sporadic deportations continued in 1943 and 1944, but basically officially in October 1942, Mihai Antonescu, who was as a more or less like the prime minister at the time, similar to that, the president of the Council of Ministers in Romania, declared the deportation is of both of the Jews and of the Roma. But the damage was done. And then the interesting racist and eugenic arguments start to be built up. I know we're running shortly out of time, but there's the thing. In my reading of the story, the deportation was one aspect of a policy of purification. It was not meant to be, and they knew they couldn't complete it. And this is why historians tend to get stuck in why they stop with the deportation and say, well, it happened and it stopped, not understanding that actually the most tragic had it continued, had it been implemented, had it succeeded, I mean, it would have been the same with Germany, of course. Would have in Romania, the situation developed in 1943, 1944. And I have some examples here. Very quickly, I would say, on the one hand, they finally realized that, okay, they could racially explain why the Jews are a problem and they have to be eliminated, taken away, exterminated. So there's this racist anti-Semitism. We have racist anti-Semitic laws since 1938 in Romania, similar to what you have in Nazi Germany and other parts of Eastern Europe. But with the Roma, it's more complex because of the way they infiltrated, the way they assimilated, the way they were sort of mixed with the Romanian population. And it took some time for the eugenicists to build that argument. And by 1943, they're actually getting to it when they start talking about the Romanians by blood. And they're arguing, and I have two documents here we found, courtesy of my very distinguished scholar friend, Nicu Furtuna, who very kindly sent them to me. And here we have a discussion already in 1942 where the Roma are referred to as ethnically non-Romanian. So they can, by blood, by race, they cannot be Romanians. They are Romanian citizens, like many others, but by blood, you cannot be Romanian. And very clearly it's being said here, the Roma are not Romanians by blood, right? And further on his side, you can see the other document. So you have this already is happening. So then you have the entire legal procedures, and I've written an article about that, the entire legal discussion about how can we codify anti-Roma and anti-Roma racism, anti-Roma eugenics in law. So they were getting there. And the other one is by 1944 early, when they established this massive institute of ethno-racial research, the ethno-racial and biology, which they wanted to name after Ion Antonescu, which would deal with the entire problem of purification in Romania and create a Romania for Romanians. And you have all the sections here. So this is something that we only recently come across. We finally now, I've written about that, and I demonstrate very clearly that what we need to do is continue to look at anti-Roma racism and eugenics and the Holocaust in Romania until 1944, rather than look at when they stopped the deportation of the Jews and the Roma. My reading is that that explains some things, but it doesn't explain the entire complexity of the World War situation and how they went about transforming Romania into basically a racial utopia. It didn't work out, as you know and others who are listening know. In 1944, Romania turned against Nazi Germany, and of course, Ion Antonescu is deposed, and then that's a different conversation. But what happened, of course, and that's the last slide I think I have, is that for a very long time, we didn't talk about the Roma Holocaust, Paul. We didn't know, although, there were people many survivors, but only recently they were interviewed. And I think the oldest survivor we have from Transnistria died in 2014. He was 108. So a very interesting character. And luckily, some of the Roma scholars I've been working with, and I'm indebted to for their research. Some of their names are here: Nicu Furtuna, or Ion Duminica, or Petru Petcuț, Mihai Neac, Delia Grigore, Magda Matache. Some of the names that people should remember. They actually, for the past 10 years or so, finally were able to bring together a scholarship, a Roma scholarship about the Holocaust. But at the same time, that's the point I want to finish with. They tried to transform the discussion about racism and eugenics in Romania from the point of view of their voice being heard, and from the point of view of the majority being able to come to terms with the skeletons in the closet. Like Audre Lorde said, and I will finish with that, the famous poet and black activist, how do we transform silence into language and then language into action? How do we transform the silence about the Roma Holocaust and the Roma slavery into a language that people understand that we can use to communicate and pass on knowledge and engage in debate. And then once we've done that, Paul, we turn to action, because action is what matters.
No, definitely. And, my kind of last comments are going to be kind of really about when we study the Holocaust with regards to the Auschwitz and the death camps, things like that, because the Third Reich ended so very precisely in 1945. That regime just ended, boom, overnight. With Romania, like we have with other countries, it's a bit more of a morphing into a next phase. So it's hard to know, because we said at the beginning, the racism carries on after the war a bit. So it's therefore a little bit more difficult to study because it doesn't have that neat period to contain it with. I didn't express myself very well there. I think I knew what I meant to say, but it seems to me that this is more of it's equally a study of where Romania is now as where Romania is in World War II, and indeed where Romania was before World War II.
You're absolutely right. And this is why I pointed back in time to slavery, and I'm pointing towards the future. And I speak about activism, and I speak about reckoning, and I speak about the need to go out there. So we may use, as you do, the Second World War as a moment in time, but you use it also as a prism through which we can understand more global and more, historically important events that come across and cut across historical periods and societies, and basically infuses our modern geography with a new sense of importance, because we need to understand what happened then a bit better, maybe try to understand what's happening at the moment through the lens of the past.
We have a good question from Ian Carr there that may be quite a big one to answer, but it's what post-war during the Ceausescu regime, was there more inclusivity offered towards the Roma? Was there a bit more of acceptance of them? I mean, or is it not quite as simple as that? Is it an evolution over the years?
There was certainly attempts to include and assimilate the Roma. In 1948, there was an attempt to have them recognized as a minority, but then it didn't happen. So during communism, the Roma were not recognized as a minority, basically, in Ceausescu's Romania. So that's only in the 1990s when that happened. So that's one important thing. So from the point of view of the regimes, we're not talking about a distinct group of people. So then they have to be treated the same as everyone else. Now, of course, regrettably, under the veneer of rhetoric, discrimination continued. And although many Roma did progress significantly economically and socially under communism, they were subjected to numerous discriminatory practices. Romania, in this case, is a more sort of, gray area. But we have other examples in the Eastern Bloc, in Roma women being sterilized in Czechoslovakia. So we have numerous examples of how eugenic and sort of racist biomedical racism was directed at Roma in Czechoslovakia. In Romania, the situation is a bit more complex in many ways, because allegedly they were not discriminated against because the law prevented that. The law prevented any discrimination based on race or ethnicity. In practice, however, of course, everybody knew that who was the Romanian, who was the Hungarian, who was the Roma, and accordingly, the situation worked to the point that by 1990s, Romania emerges from Eastern Europe, the country with the most significantly damaged reputation in terms of its treatment of the Roma population. A reputation that Romania has tried, of course, hard to repair, and progress has been made. But the roots of the problem should be looked at not only under communism, and that's a very important question. That's the period we have. If we do want to understand the current economic and social problems with Roma are facing in Eastern Europe and in Romania in particular, communism is the period we need to understand very well and look at. But if we really want to understand other mental and behavioral patterns, we need to go a bit further back, as you did, Paul, today, by looking at the interwar period and then the Holocaust and the Second World War to understand the tectonic plates of Romanian racism and Romanian eugenics in the long term.
No, definitely. It seems to me, that although some people might argue there's not much we can say about the big part of the Holocaust that we know about, as I said, Auschwitz and the death camps and Belsen and Sobibor, with regards to the other countries, not just Eastern Europe, but also into the Balkans as well, we've only really scratched the surface of all the different types of genocides and prejudices and hatreds. And one of the most commented on shows I ever did was about what I called Yugoslavia and World War II. And it's a subject I want to go into again, because you've got, the different factions and politics and races and it's, as with Romania, as with Estonia and Lithuania and the Ukraine, it's horribly topically, there's a lot more work to be done on this outside of that main focus of the Holocaust. And well, I will bring things to end, Marius, and I think there's some shows I sit and I just learn, and today has been one of those shows where I've just absorbed it like a sponge. When it's an Operation Market Gardener show, I jump in with my opinions, but today I've just been learning. So thank you very much for bringing what is obviously a very personal subject to you, and something that you're not finished with. I clearly, we're midway through your research into this, and there's a lot more to do.
It's been a real pleasure, Paul. Thank you very much for giving me this chance to, well, firstly, talk to you about these important issues, and secondly, share my opinion and have the possibility to bring some people new to the conversation. The conversation must go on, as you pointed out. We're just only scratching the surface.
Absolutely. Well, I'll remind folks that the link to Marius's book, Blood and Homeland, which is about the kind of first half of the 20th century, is in the description below. Tomorrow, we are continuing our look at Romania with a similar topic, but we're looking more broadly at the Holocaust in Romania. So another tough evening's viewing for you folks. But it's important to understand some of the nastier side of World War II, so that when a show comes along where we talk about aircraft, we can enjoy it, because we do the balance. We talk about the good stuff and the bad stuff. So thank you very much for joining us. If you're new to World War II TV, or if you've not been able to do so recently, please think about subscribing. Please think about liking every video you watch. Like is a weird word to use with a topic like today, but we mean like the fact that we brought you this subject. You're not liking the subject matter, you're liking the discussion. So there we go. So thank you very much, Marius. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying thank you very much for your time this evening. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.